Hi, this is Verna DeLauer, and welcome to Webinar 2. I want to quickly review what we've gone over during our last couple of weeks. We've been introduced to qualitative research and what it can offer you as CTP coordinators. We've also reviewed the idea of case studies, and I've given a hypothetical case study, and you have chosen some case studies yourself to think about in relation to this training. We've gone over the idea of overarching research questions, so questions that guide our research. We've also talked about different data collection techniques such as interviews and focus groups, and the questions that are used for those data collection techniques. During our training call last week, I heard a couple of things from all of you. One was that in our group of students, we have a range of experience with qualitative research, from interviews, focus groups, and some survey experience as well. And that you want to use your existing venues to collect and analyze data. So it sounds like some of you may be set up in really good situations to be collecting and analyzing data. Also, I heard that the idea of mixed method research is of interest, and we'll talk about that in this webinar. And overall, it sounds like qualitative research could potentially help you to improve your programs and to understand certain barriers that were expressed during our training. So today we'll talk a little bit about mixed method approaches. We'll continue our discussion on data collection questions, and then we'll begin our coding discussion. So let's begin with mixed methods. Here are a couple definitions that are pertinent to mixed methods. Mixed methods means qualitative and quantitative methods used together. So let's look at the first quote. Once a proposition has been confirmed by two or more independent measurement processes, the uncertainty of its interpretation is greatly reduced. So we'll talk a little bit about what are the benefits of mixed methods and how that can really add to your study. The second quote, all research is interpretive, and we face a multiplicity of methods that are suitable for different kinds of understandings. So the traditional means of coming to grips with one's identity as a researcher by aligning oneself with a particular set of methods, or being defined in one's department as a student of qualitative or quantitative methods, is no longer very useful. If we are to go forward, we need to get rid of that distinction. And this quote is from quite a while ago. And from my experience, I believe that this still holds true and perhaps is more prevalent in the environmental field, that qualitative and quantitative are equally important and can answer different kinds of questions, and when used together can really be exciting and very useful. So why use mixed methods? Well, there are strengths and weaknesses. Some of the strengths are that words and pictures and narrative in qualitative research can be used to add meaning to numbers. And vice versa, numbers can be used to add precision to words, pictures, and narrative. A researcher can generate theory through qualitative research and test that theory through quantitative research. If you use a mixed methods, you can answer a broader and more complete range of research questions because you're not confined to a single method or approach. Also, you can use the strengths of one method to overcome the weaknesses in the other method by using both in a research study. In addition, you can provide stronger evidence for a conclusion through convergence and corroboration of findings. And this is particularly important if you have an audience who may be skeptical of one kind of research method over another. You can add insights and understanding that might be missed when only a single method is used. And what we talked a little bit about during our training, generalizability in qualitative research, well, mixed methods can be used to increase the generalizability of the results because you're testing theory with a large population. But there are also some weaknesses. Mixed methods approaches can be difficult for a single researcher to carry out, especially if two or more approaches are expected to be used concurrently. So if you're going to collect data simultaneously, that could be very difficult for one researcher. So it might require a research team. You also have to learn about multiple methods and approaches and understand how to mix them appropriately. It can be more expensive, more time consuming, and also some of the details of mixed research remain to be worked out fully by research methodologists. Here are a few considerations when using mixed methods. Through the process of qualitative and quantitative analysis, you are inherently reducing your data to leave you with something meaningful. Think back to the funnel design in webinar 1. So you'll need to decide whether you want to correlate your data sets or consolidate the data sets to create a new data set. So for example, are you testing the qualitative results with quantitative methods, or are you taking results from both and understanding how they fit together to tell a story? Another consideration is you may want to display your data, and you can pictorially describe the qualitative data through things like word clouds and cluster diagrams. But you also want to find a way to graphically represent the quantitative data so that both data sets visually support one another. And lastly, you can also transform the data, wherein qualitative data can be converted into numerical codes that can be represented statistically. So let's review the funnel approach to your research design. You are narrowing what you want to know through the process of qualitative methods, then testing it with quantitative methods in this research design. So first, we will use some qualitative methods to build rapport through participant observation, do some interviews. That helps us to narrow our research questions and develop a theory, potentially, and then test that theory through quantitative analysis and hypothesis testing. Now, each one of these data sets in and of themselves can be looked at separately. So you could have significant findings from both the qualitative piece of this funnel approach and the quantitative, and you can also look at them as a whole. So let's use this funnel approach to address a case study. Currently, Chris Fort and I are working on a project for the Wells Reserve. We're interested in understanding people's perceptions about riparian areas within 3 counties in Maine. We want to look at those working to protect water resources, as well as those who use water resources. First, we spoke with other organizations who partner with the Wells Reserve to understand what they believed was needed to better communicate messages about riparian areas to a range of stakeholders and citizens. This happened as a formal discussion similar to a focus group. Then we conducted qualitative interviews with a range of stakeholders from different interests. We're in the process of coding those interviews and then creating mental maps from the results. And that's another research methodology that we probably won't be able to get to in this training. We use the mental mapping results as part of a survey that is going out to thousands of households in the study area to test those results with a larger population. So the qualitative research in this case can stand alone. It will have significant findings, but we're taking it a step further to the quantitative survey. But we're also learning how to work with the economists on the research team who are creating the survey to understand how can we conduct a meaningful mixed methods approach that offers the reserve a comprehensive result. Now let's move on to data collection questions. So just as a reminder, there are a couple of different types of interviews: structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Structured interviews is where the interviewer follows scripted questions. There's no deviations from the question order, so wording of each question is asked exactly as it is written. There's no adjusting of the language. Semi-structured interviews is where the interviewer initiates questions and poses probes in response to the interviewee's descriptions. And we'll talk about probes a little bit later in the webinar. So questions may be reordered during the interview, where it makes sense, and the level of language may also be adjusted. Lastly, unstructured interviews really are about free-flowing conversation. So they're completely unstructured. There's no set order to any questions. Just see what emerges during the conversation. And during our training, we talked about that within those different types of qualitative interviews, there are data collection questions. And as a reminder, these kinds of questions are not to be confused with research questions. So research questions are about what you want to know, and data collection questions are those you need to ask to find out what you want to know. We won't be talking about descriptive questions, but they are good to begin with. So again, questions that help to break the ice, like what is your role within the organization? So let's talk about each type of question separately and do a couple of exercises. We'll start with storytelling questions. Storytelling questions encourage more in-depth conversation from the participant. So you might begin a storytelling question by saying, can you tell me more about X, Y, and Z? So now I'd like you to pause the video and in your journal complete the following exercise. Here is the hypothetical scenario. You would like to understand commercial fishers' perceptions of state ocean policy. So I'd like you to brainstorm one or two storytelling questions. Here are some examples of storytelling questions that I came up with from that scenario. So one is, can you tell me more about state ocean policy in your state? So this really leaves things very open for that person to just tell you what comes to their mind. And hopefully a story will emerge from that. You can also ask them to give you an example. So can you give me an example of your experience with state ocean policy? And chances are that example will be in the form of a story. Let's move on to opinion questions. So as a reminder, opinion questions get at participants' impressions, feelings, assertions. So things like, what do you consider to be the ideal staff meeting? So I'd like you to pause the video and in your journal complete the following exercise. Scenario: you are interested in exploring effective and repeatable methods for constructing national training products through a large and diverse network of contributors. You want to know, what is it about the collaborative process that works and does not work? Brainstorm one or two opinion questions. Here are some examples of opinion questions. So one might be, what do you consider to be an effective collaborative process? So again, leaving it open, but getting their opinion. Another is, in what ways is the current collaborative process effective? So that's being a little bit more specific and asking them in what ways. So that offers them a chance to give their opinion. And similarly, but from a different perspective, in what ways is the current collaborative process not effective? Let's move on to structural questions. These are questions that tap into people's ideologies. So, for instance, how did you come to that way of thinking? We talked about this on the training call. So now I'd like you to pause the video and in your journal complete the following exercise. Here's your scenario. You want to improve your programs and know whether you are really meeting the needs of your participants. Brainstorm 1 or 2 structural questions. Here are my examples of structural questions. What do you believe you are getting out of the programs you attend? So here you're getting at beliefs. How did you come to this belief? So you're getting at beliefs, and then you're asking them to further explain that belief and talk about perhaps a more broader ideology. Now let's move on to hypothetical questions. So in hypothetical questions, you could set up a scenario for them. That's one way of beginning, as you will see in my example. But also on the training call, we talked about using the opposite of what is the ideal to them. So I think the example that I used on the call is that, um, if someone said that they were a vegetarian, well, what would it mean to you if you could not be a vegetarian? So now I'd like you to pause the video and in your journal complete the following exercise. Your scenario is that your project team meetings are not effective. You have a hunch that the different personalities in the room just do not work well together. There's tension. There are power struggles. There are people who typically take over the conversation and others who are left out of it. I'd like you to brainstorm 1 or 2 hypothetical questions. So some examples, one is, again, setting up the hypothetical scenario for them. Think for a moment about someone in the project meetings who has a different personality or style of working than you. What would it be like to be in their position? So hypothetically, what would it be like to be in their position? And then using that idea of the opposite, what if there were no project meetings? Let's talk about devil's advocate questions. So these questions challenge the respondent to consider an opposing view. So, for example, you might say, some would say that there is no hope to staff meetings. How would you respond? So I'd like you to pause the video. In your journal, complete the following exercise. Here's your scenario. More often than not, there are municipal officials who do not show up to your meetings and trainings. You want to understand the barriers to participation, and you also want to know how to motivate them to participate. Brainstorm 1 or 2 devil's advocate questions. Here are some examples. One is, some say that municipal officials shouldn't attend our meetings. How would you respond? So this could be particularly effective if you're talking to a municipal official who maybe doesn't attend the meetings. You're getting their opinion, but you're also provoking them a bit. Another example is, others say they are just not motivated to attend our meetings. How would you motivate them? And lastly, let's talk about integrated questions. So these questions test what the respondent has been saying by asking for a reaction. So these kinds of questions will really come up based on the respondent's responses to you. So here's the scenario. You are struck by the fact that people agree that improving wastewater treatment is an urgent matter, yet progress is slow. You want to know people's views about the different wastewater treatment technologies and how they perceive they will affect their communities. You also want to know what are the factors that slow progress. Brainstorm 1 or 2 interpretive questions. Here are some examples. Tell me about the different wastewater treatment technologies. Now, from that, you will probably be able to interpret their answer and ask another question. So, interpretive questions set you up for being able to probe deeper. Another is, how does that particular technology affect your community? And lastly, it sounds like you, like many others, understand the issues. So in this case, you're already interpreting something from what they've said. How would you describe the progress that has been made? So you're building upon that assumption or that interpretation. And to bring out answers to interpretive questions and other questions, you might need to probe a bit. So, for instance, you might need to say things like, "You mentioned something, tell me more about that." Or, "You mentioned something, what was that like for you? You talked about X, Y, and Z. Can you describe that experience in as much detail as possible?" Also asking, "What else happened?" to get them to continue to talk. Or, "What were your feelings about that?" If you sense some emotion behind what they're saying, you could say, "It sounds as though you had a pretty strong reaction." So rather than, "It sounds like you were angry," or "It sounds like you were happy," it sounds like you had a pretty strong emotion, and see, or reaction, and see what, if, or whether they describe that reaction. And lastly, you might say something like, "It sounds like you're saying," and then try to reiterate what they're saying and sort of test whether or not you're hearing them correctly. Now I'd like you to pause the video and in your journal, answer the following question. Which type of data collection questions best fit your case study and why? So, given what you're thinking about, your case, do you anticipate using a lot of storytelling questions, a lot of hypothetical questions, a mix? You're not sure? Are there any that resonate with you, especially given the examples? Lastly, we'll cover coding. Here's a quote about coding. "Being in the world requires us to categorize, sort, prioritize, and interpret social data in all of our interactions," which many of you are finding in your own work. Coding qualitative data is merely a formalization of this process in order to apply it to research and to provide some structure as a way of conveying our interpretations to others. So I believe this quote very much is in line with what we've been talking about in relation to your role as CTP coordinators. So, why code? Coding is the process of systematically assigning themes or codes to your data. There are coding programs, such as NVivo, you may have heard of this, or you can code by hand. So the coding programs are software that enable you to code. And if you want to look up NVivo, it's NVIVO. They have a website with lots of videos and tutorials to help you get through coding and understanding the software. Coding begins with reading your data and highlighting themes. And that's pretty much the extent to which we'll begin coding today. The purpose of coding is to reduce data, organize data, and then explore and analyze data, and eventually, as we've been talking about, build a theory out of that data. The process of coding is part of the analysis. So rather than imagining that analysis of the data is something that begins after the coding is finished, we should recognize that coding is analysis. As we talked about during our training, the process of qualitative research is iterative, and you're continually mining the data and going over it and refining and integrating. And in order to do that, you need to code. Coding is in many ways a recursive juggling act of starting with initial codes that come from the research questions, literature, and categories inherent in the project, and progressing through codes that are more interpretive as patterns, relationships, and differences arise. So for my staff meeting example that I've been using, you may start with some initial codes that are things you want to look for in the data, such as showing respect or responsibility. You then go through that iterative process we talked about and begin to interpret the data in new ways and potentially creating different codes or building upon the ones you have. So coding is reflexive as well. As new themes emerge, previously coded material will need to be recoded to include the new concepts. coding helps you reveal messages in the data. So if you think of data as a messenger, there are manifest messages that are blatant and obvious. So you may read through the data and you'll see certain themes, patterns, messages that are pretty obviously coming out of the data. But through that iterative process and through looking at those manifest messages, you'll start to understand some of the implied and underlying messages, which are called latent messages. So manifest messages lead to latent messages as you interpret the data in new ways. And these messages that you're getting from the data are what you turn into codes. And there are different types of codes. Sometimes they're categorized as descriptive codes and analytic codes. So descriptive codes might help you to answer who, what, when, where, why, and how. By understanding descriptive codes, you may then, or analytic codes may emerge. Analytic codes may reveal themselves because of some important theme or pattern in the data. So when you're actually coding, and we'll go through some exercises, what are you looking for? Well, you can develop a coding guide. So you know what your research questions are. You know the kinds of themes you might be looking for in the data. So use that as a starting point. It might mean that at the end of your analysis, none of those themes or none of those codes are relevant, but you need to start somewhere. Now, the types of coding themes that you can look for are the following. You can look for conditions. So things like how does the person talk about what they're doing? You know, what are the conditions that they're in currently? Are they unemployed, for instance? Do they live in Wells, Maine? Another is interactions. Do they talk about interactions between and among them and others? Do they talk about strategies and tactics related to your research question? Do they talk about consequences that are maybe of interest? Do they perceive certain things? What kinds of meanings come out of what they say? What do they place meaning on? Do they talk about specific places or people? Do they talk about themselves and how they came to a way of thinking or who they are? And that who they are is important to the types of questions you're asking. Do they bring up memories? Do they talk about differences between and among themselves and others or among others? Do you notice any representations and associations that they're making that might be of interest? So let's practice coding. I'd like you to get out your coding worksheet and follow along with the PowerPoint. If you read the directions on your coding worksheet, you will read a series of excerpts from real interviews and pick out what you believe to be an important theme or themes. So I'd like you to pause the video and try coding this excerpt using the directions on your worksheet. I was a Boy Scout many years ago. We didn't have environment, we had conservation. I was taught and believed that all things are connected and that there is a food chain and that it's necessary to preserve those things. I went to school and I was interested in natural resources and took a fair amount of coursework and a lot of general natural science stuff. I studied economics, and I believe if you want to know how the world works, you need to know who has the money. I guess I was raised on a tradition that believes that you have to think about the future and leave something for the next person. Those are some of the things that make me believe the way I do. I feel comfortable in the outdoors. I think the natural world is very beautiful. I get excited about seeing animals. I've made a conscious decision as to how I live and where I live. It's very important to me. So you might think back to those themes on the last slide and determine what you might look for in the data, as well as using your worksheet directions as a guide. So there were a few themes that I noticed here. So one, and I highlighted those in different colors. So codes can be words, they can be phrases, they can be sentences, they could be paragraphs, they could be pages. Here I've picked out words and phrases. So I coded Boy Scout. We talked about that theme of condition. Well, he's talking about he was a Boy Scout. He's not currently a Boy Scout, but his past condition was that he was a Boy Scout, for example. He also talks about that he was a student. So I could have highlighted that if I thought it was pertinent. I coded, I was taught and believe that all things are connected and there is a food chain and that it's necessary to preserve those things. And you need to know who has the money. I guess I was raised on a tradition that believes that you have to think about the future and leave something for the next person. So he's talking about his beliefs, his memories, and who he is personally, his sense of self, and his sense of himself in relation to the world and to what he cares about and to the types of questions that I'm asking him. Here's another example that I'd like you to code, again, using the directions in your worksheet. I would define value as achieving a reasonable balance between a number of competing interests that recognizes both science and reality in a complex social economic setting. In terms of development and environmental protection, I think it's important to consider a number of factors, such as the functions values of the resource, the locality, project need, surrounding landscape, and development. As an example, we've been involved with projects where a natural resource has been identified that is already impacted and has little or no functional value. Many agricultural and farming fields can technically be classified as wetlands even though they are no longer serving an ecological function. On the other hand, riverine systems that may contain cold water fisheries and are headwaters with filtering wetlands serve as an important ecosystem and deserve heightened protection. The challenge is often people, their perceptions and interpretations of the regulations and value of the resources. This often results in conflict and requires a balanced approach between social, economic needs, and protection. So there were a few themes that I noticed here. This idea of defining value. So he defines value as achieving a reasonable balance between a number of competing interests. He also talks about what he thinks is important to consider. So a number of factors, such as functions and values of the resource. And lastly, he talks about the challenges that he believes are in existence, and that people and their perceptions and interpretations are challenges. And that in order to deal with these challenges, you need to have a balanced approach. So, in summary, he talks a little bit about consequences of believing a certain thing or not. He talks about his perception of what is value and what he perceives to be the challenge. And he also talks about the meaning he places on value. And here is a last example that I'd like you to read, and again, using the directions on your worksheet, code. I've come to this belief many years ago that we are custodians, not owners. And we have behaved as owners, and we need to shift our philosophy of land use to custodianship. That is the essence of what is behind the green movement. Bottom line is that we have to look at how we use the ground from a custodian's point of view. Inherent in that is looking at the capacity and the ability of a piece of property to withstand or support the activity we want to put on it, as opposed to, I can use the land any way I want, and therefore I'm going to impose something. So here I would code a few things. This idea of we are custodians and not owners, and that what we need to do. So this person has strong beliefs of what we need to do to shift our philosophy, this idea of custodianship. So some of the themes I noticed here are in relation to belief and also in relation to metaphor, right? This idea of being custodians. So this is the end of webinar 2. For our February 6th training call, I'd like you to post any questions you have about coding on Basecamp. I'd like you to make use of our office hours on February 5th. Feel free to call. We've only just begun coding, and there's a lot more to teach, and it can be complicated, but fun. Make sure for your call you have your journal on hand with all the exercises that you've done on this webinar. And also, I'd like you to read the papers that are posted on GoTo Training Library. Thank you.